Hello and welcome to Science Never Stops. I'm your host, Joseph Vick with the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, here today with NASA Marshall Space Flight Center guest, a lead aerospace engineer currently working on the Mars Ascent Vehicle, Darius Yaghoubi. Welcome, Darius, to Science Never Stops.
Happy to be here.
All right, well, let's start with our first question here. Could you please explain to our viewers your field of engineering and tell us about the current project you're working with out at Marshall?
So I am in aerospace engineering, and when I say that, that actually is a kind of a loaded statement, because you could have 10 people all with the title aerospace engineer, and they all do things kind of differently. So in general, though, the main thing we all have in common is that we do engineering on things that fly. So specifically at NASA, it's usually associated with aircraft or spacecraft. Specifically at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center, we're looking at usually launch vehicles or spacecraft. So things that fly either into space or things that are already in space. And the main differentiator between aerospace engineering and a lot of other types of engineering is that we are usually very restricted in terms of mass. So if you look at something like mechanical engineering, for the most part, they're looking at operations on the ground. So weight isn't a huge concern, but if you're shooting things up into space, well, that is, kind of concern. So aerospace engineers, they can work on all sorts of different types of things that fly or different components within that. Some may work on aerodynamics, some may work on structures, some may work on thermal. My background is in GNC, guidance, navigation, and control, although these days I'm working more on the systems engineering role on the Mars Ascent Vehicle. And systems engineering kind of takes a look at all of those individual components of aerospace engineering and makes sure that they all work together and they all integrate properly. So I mentioned before, the project I'm working on is the Mars Ascent Vehicle. It is a small launch vehicle when you look at kind of some of the other vehicles that NASA develops that lift off from Earth, and the main reason for that is because we're lifting off from Mars. The primary mission of the Mars Ascent Vehicle is actually part of the Mars Sample Return Campaign, which, as you may have gathered from the context of the title, the whole mission of the Mars Sample Return Campaign is to bring some portions of Mars back to Earth to be studied. And within that campaign, the Mars Ascent Vehicle essentially takes those samples from the surface of Mars up into orbit, where it'll be captured by a separate spacecraft and brought back to Earth.
That's awesome. So we'll have our first real pieces of planet Mars to tangibly look at and hold and study.
Not necessarily, actually. We've actually gotten some chunks of Mars before, but they're usually in meteorites. So meteorites that have, meteors or chunks of Mars that were flung up into Martian orbit however many eons ago, or out into the solar system, and they spent however many millennia just floating around in orbit around the sun until eventually they crashed into Earth. But obviously those are, they're very, very old. They've been through all sorts of thermal conditions and radiation, so they're a lot different than what we would gather from the surface. So these will be right from the surface, though. So there will be whatever the Perseverance rover is able to dig up for us.
Great. Well, that sounds exciting. Are there certain sort of things within that soil sample or that sort of Mars regolith sample that you're looking forward to or wanting to try to discover?
Well, the jackpot would be life, obviously. I mean, if we found any sign of life in there at all, it would be a major scientific breakthrough, one of the biggest discoveries in terms of science that we have ever had. Now, the odds of that are pretty low from what we already understand, but we cannot rule it out 100%. So more than likely, it's going to be just dirt, soil, sand, potentially mud, maybe ice, maybe water. That would be really a big thing too, because then, that could confirm a lot of other things that we would know about Mars. There could be alien fossils. It sounds kind of science fiction, but it is a possibility. And then lastly, some bits of Martian atmosphere as well.
So with this sample collection that you're taking, the method in which it is taken and stored, I'm sure, is pretty valuable for that sample. How would that collection and that storage how will it be preserved, or how will it be contained for that length of time before it's truly taken from Perseverance to the next step?
Right. So Perseverance is actually very similar to the Curiosity rover, which is currently up on Mars right now, except the main instrument on the head of it is a giant drill. So it drills into the Martian surface or some rocks around the area that we're looking at, the Jezero crater, which is believed to be an ancient lake bed. And it will take some of the samples of the Mars surface out and seal it itself within individual sample tubes. And actually, you know what? I think I may have a 3D printed version of one of these sample tubes around here somewhere. Here it is. This is a 3D printed version of it, and just to give you an idea of its size, this is just a standard pen. So it's not much bigger than a pen, but it's a little bit faster than one. So we're going to collect, actually the Perseverance rover is going to collect a ton of these and just kind of leave them all over the Martian surface, and in just specific caches where they can be collected laser.
How many grams worth of sample will that hold?
This individually one, well, we're planning on lifting about 30 of these up into Martian orbit, which will carry a grand total of about 0.5 kilogram of Martian sample within it. So not that much. Somebody asked me the other day after they had seen the movie The Martian, how many Matt Damons can you put on the Mars ascent vehicle? And I actually did some quick math, and it came down to about 0.0058 Matt Damons can ride in our vehicle.
Okay.
So, but anyway, getting back to what I was saying before, so the Perseverance rover, it loads them and seals them in these little sample tubes, leaves them all over the Martian surface. Then once we land, we're actually launching from Earth in July 2026. We should be landing there around 2028, 2029 time period. There will be on a lander, on board the lander also will be a small fetch rover about the same size as like Spirit and Opportunity. And its sole job will be to go out and collect these sample tubes that the Perseverance rover has left all over the surface and bring them back to the lander where we'll be stored, and it will load those sample tubes into our payload bay. So there's one level of sealing there, just in each of these individual sample tubes. So once the payload bay has been loaded up, that will be closed up and sealed kind of by itself. And so there'll be kind of one version of being sealed there, and that will kind of close everything up in our nose cone. So after we launch into orbit and we have successfully achieved the desired orbit that we want, we'll be ejecting that payload, which will be a small beach ball size object called the OZ, the orbiting sample, which will contain 30 of these, and that will be launched into orbit around Mars, where the Earth Return Orbiter, or ERO, will capture them, and it will do its own kind of sealing, because there may be some Martian dust or something stuck on the outside of the OZ, and we want to make sure that we can limit any type of exposure of the Martian samples or atmosphere to Earth, because we don't want to have any type of uncontrolled release of potential contaminants. So the ERO will do its own kind of sealing around that, and then a secondary sealing. And that's what we call a break the chain, because we want to break the chain of any contaminants. And it's going to make sure that those are heated up and sealed around completely before coming back to Earth. So then lastly, when we get to Earth, it's going to slam into the Utah desert. We're not going to worry about any parachutes or anything, because if we design it to work with parachutes and then the parachutes fail, then we could have a potential structural issue when it impacts the Earth. So that's going to slam into the desert, very, very high loads once it hits the Earth. We don't want to worry about having to capture it in the ocean or anything either like that. And that will be contained within a few layers of sealing. And then that will obviously be taken back to a very secure facility where the most expensive rocks ever will be extracted and sent out to, various scientists all over the world to study them.
Well, that sounds like an amazing mission to look forward to. You mentioned in detail a little bit about your aerospace engineering degree, but growing up, was there a certain class or extracurricular activity, a mentor or experience that helped shape your career path to becoming an aerospace engineer?
There were two classes actually I took in high school. The first one that was a huge influence was just basic high school physics. I say basic from an engineering standpoint now. As a high school student, it was pretty advanced. It was AP high school physics. And that's when I first really started to learn about the laws of motion to a real extent and actually do calculations on them. I had learned about laws of motion and stuff before, but hadn't really done much work with it. I knew conceptually what they were, but high school physics is where I really started doing problem solving and doing lab experiments where I got to do some actual work with it and see them actually in motion. So when I started to learn about those, I got really kind of interested in it and like just, the way objects operate in the real world. Outside of that, there was a real basic, simple intro to drafting class that I took, which had a little bit more of the kind of mechanical design aspect of it to see how physically things can fit together.
Well, as an engineer, you come up with all kinds of problem solving activities. So building new things, exploring new places, designing the future concepts. What would you say would be your biggest sort of engineering setback? And what did you do to overcome it with one of your major projects? So
I actually would go back to college on that one because fortunately at NASA I haven't had any huge major setbacks, but one thing that always stood out to me in general was when I was a senior in college. We had a senior design project where we essentially had to design, analyze, test, build, and fly our own aircraft entirely from scratch. All we were really given was a small microjet engine, maybe about that long and that wide or so. It produced about 17 pounds of thrust. We were given that. We were given some resources in the lab and some monetary resources to use to do everything essentially with it. And we essentially had 9 months to build everything from scratch and do everything on our design. So around April of my final semester in college, we were out doing a test flight for it, and we were out on the airfield getting everything run up, and we were running up the jet engine, and we had a fire break out in the engine compartment of it. And so there we were seeing literally 8 months of work that we had poured into this, very late nights in the lab and then in constructing it, literally going up in flames. And at this point in my life, I actually had already received a job offer from NASA, but it was contingent upon me graduating, and my graduation was contingent upon that aircraft flying. So myself and 6 other teammates, we were all, I was actually the one holding the fire extinguisher. So in the span of about 1 second of seeing these flames, I had all these horrifying images before my eyes of everything just not working out, So after about a second of snapping out of it and pulling the little safety pin out the fire extinguisher and putting the fire out immediately, we were all pretty bummed because we were all like, we're set to graduate in less than a month, so we really need to get this sorted out. So that was a long night.
For NASA, I'm assuming you graduated with high marks.
Well, yes. It ended up not being as bad as we thought. One of the biggest setbacks actually was that we weren't really able to fly until we figured out what caused the fire, because we didn't want it to repeat. Because if it had ended up being a flaw in the design, then obviously that would be a huge major issue. Fortunately, it ended up just being an issue with some of the fuel when we were loading it into the fuel tank had leaked down into the aft area of the engine where it gets really hot and some of the backwards plume comes out. So that had ignited and gone throughout the entire...
Ethanol engine? What did it run off?
I think it was kerosene. Yeah, it was actually just basically straight up kerosene. So... But we had a long night in the lab where we still had actually a setback on it because we had to take apart a whole bunch of different sections of the aircraft and completely rebuild some of the internal carbon fiber elements of it. And then we had to do some testing on that to make sure everything was fine with that. And eventually it did get up to fly again. So we were all good. But for a few hours there, we were all, biting our nails and really, really worried about that. Ended up working in the end, though.
All right. Well, who would you say would be your favorite scientist or engineer, and why?
Isaac Newton, by a long shot. I mentioned before when I took high school physics, I started learning all about Newtonian mechanics and all that stuff. He's the type of guy, when you read about his accomplishments, it's just like, how can one human really be that intelligent and contribute that much to the field of science? Aside from the 3 laws of motion that he came up with before, he essentially invented calculus, which is the foundation of understanding modern day physics. I don't want to say discovered gravity, but he discovered the way that you can represent it through physics and equations and all that stuff. And he just really... He took everything that we know today about modern physics. He's the guy that essentially came up with it.
Now, do you happen to have any special abilities, talents, or hobbies that might surprise people?
I can fly a plane. I got my pilot's license.
For pilot, okay, great.
So, yeah, that's the whole reason I got to the aerospace side of things. So, engineering was one side of things, but I always was interested in aviation and things that flew. I originally wanted to be a pilot back when I was younger, before I got into the more math side of things and liked engineering. So, I got my pilot's license back in 2009.
So you have a passion with aviation as well as aerospace and flying on Earth and in space.
Yep, pretty much anything that flies interests me.
Now, speaking of flying, I know flight on Earth is much different than flight on Mars due to atmospheric difference. So anything that you are currently working on with the ascent vehicle, is there an issue with entering or some sort of major calculations that you have to determine while you're doing the ascent vehicle calculations with entering Mars and exiting Mars' atmosphere?
Well, Mars's atmosphere is less than 1% of Earth's atmosphere. That less than 1%, though, is still enough to be annoying. So, because Earth's atmosphere, it's thick enough to where we can use it to our advantage to some point. Aerodynamic stability is an issue. I won't go into too many details on it. And depending on how thick certain parts of the atmosphere, you can use that to your advantage. Mars's atmosphere, however, is just thin enough to where we can just barely use that to our advantage for aerodynamic stability, but it's still thick enough to where aeroheating can be a big issue. So a lot of the assumptions that we would make about launch vehicles lifting off from Earth, we have to change some of those assumptions for the thinner atmosphere that we see on Mars.
Now, you currently are the current NASA career generation. Do you happen to have a motto or some advice to pass along to the next generation of NASA career-driven individuals that want to work for NASA one day?
Yeah, it's the one thing that I've always, it's not necessarily a motto, but just one thing I always try and keep in mind is a lot of the tasks we do at NASA, when you first kind of get handed them, they seem just insurmountable. Like when we first start thinking about bringing back a piece of Mars to study here on Earth, that just sounds how do we even start with that? Where do you even begin? The easiest thing you can really do is just chip away at it, one small tiny piece at a time. Just start off what's the very first thing that you would need to do? Think about that and then break that down even smaller bits until you've got one small thing that you can accomplish in, just what can I do in the next hour to help with this? And slowly work that up. Expand your team, and if everyone is all doing that together, it eventually starts taking big chunks out of this task. And when I look back where I was a few years ago when I first started working on this program, I was thinking, how am I even going to start this? How can I even begin this? I mean, people have been trying to do this stuff for years, and they haven't gotten as far as where we are. But eventually, if you just keep chipping away at it, and you have the right people that can, have the right passion, determination in the background, and they know what they're doing, then you can get it going.
That has to be the best engineering answer I have ever heard. Chip away at it.
That's
little bitty
that's good. That's good to hear.
Full big picture problem. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add or say about the current project that you're working on for our viewers that are interested, or where they could go and learn more about it online?
Well, I'll say the Mars Ascent Vehicle, the MAV, is still in very early design phases. So you probably won't be seeing too much in terms of the construction of it for the next few years. Like we could kind of log on to like JPL server and see the Perseverance rover being built, for example. The Perseverance rover, however, is still part of the same campaign as us, so you can still get updates regularly once that does get to Mars. It's launching later this year. Like I mentioned before, they're going to be drilling up some of the samples. We're set to launch from Earth, however, the MAV, in 2026. So we'll start construction towards the final few years towards that. We should be landing on Mars around 2028, launching around 2029, and we should be getting samples back to Earth around 2031. So about 11 years from now is when we should start to see these bits of Mars coming back to Earth.
And that'll be using NASA's next generation rocket, the Space Launch System?
Actually, the launch vehicle has not yet been determined what we'll be leaving Earth from. There's a few different contenders, SLS being one of them. There aren't that many options for slinging something as far as Mars yet right now, but SLS is definitely one of our options.
All right. Well, last thing is a fun question. With science reality, there's also science fiction that paves the way for science reality. What would you say would be your best or your favorite sort of science fiction media that you enjoy?
Star Wars.
Star Wars.
I have a heavy love for both Star Wars, Star Trek, and sci-fi, science fiction in general. But Star Wars is what got me really hyped as a kid. Han Solo, I always found would be, he was an ace pilot, and he was kind of, he wasn't the lawful guy. He was kind of a scoundrel, but he was fun, and that whole aspect really interested me as a kid, and it's carried through until today.
So you could be the Han Solo of the MAV.
I would like to. I would love to take that title on. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you again, Darius, for joining us today, and for all our viewers tuning in, remember, science never stops.